The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a forgotten town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. It was the summer of 1887, and the drought had been particularly cruel that year. Wells ran dry, crops withered, and even the hardiest souls found themselves questioning their faith in this unforgiving land. In the shadows of the town's orphanage, a ramshackle building that had seen better days, lived a girl named Clara. At 12 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that comes only from surviving hardship. Her auburn hair, often tangled and dusty, caught the light like copper wire, and her green eyes held a depth that seemed far too old for her young face. Clara had been at the orphanage for as long as she could remember, with no family to speak of and no prospects beyond the daily struggle for survival. The orphanage was run by Mrs. Blackwood, a woman whose heart had turned as hard as the desert stones beneath their feet. She was tall and gaunt, with sharp features that seemed carved from granite and eyes like winter frost. Mrs. Blackwood ruled the orphanage with an iron fist, believing that suffering built character and that children, especially orphaned ones, needed to learn their place in the world through discipline and deprivation. Clara, Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a whip crack. Get yourself out here this instant. Clara emerged from the small storage room where she had been sorting through donated clothes, her hands still dusty from the work. She kept her eyes downcast, knowing that meeting Mrs. Blackwood's gaze directly would only invite more trouble. "Yes, ma'am," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the gaps in the orphanage's weathered walls. "The water barrel needs filling again, and I won't have you children dying of thirst on my watch. Take the bucket and head to the well. And Clara," Mrs. Blackwood's voice dropped to a menacing whisper, "if you dawdle or spill even a drop, you'll spend the night in the cellar with the rats." Clara nodded quickly, grabbing the heavy wooden bucket that seemed almost as large as she was. The well was nearly a quarter-mile from the orphanage, and the bucket, when full, would be almost too heavy for her small frame to manage. But she had learned long ago not to complain, not to show weakness, and certainly not to cry where Mrs. Blackwood could see. As she made her way down the dusty path toward the well, Clara passed the remnants of what had once been a thriving town. Redemption Creek had been built during the gold rush, but when the mines played out and the railroad passed them by, most folks had moved on to greener pastures. Now only the most stubborn or desperate remained, clinging to their small plots of land and fading dreams. The well sat at the edge of town, surrounded by a few scraggly cottonwood trees that provided the only shade for miles. As Clara approached, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There, lying in the meager shade of the largest tree, was a horse unlike any she had ever seen. The animal was magnificent, even in its current state. Its coat was a deep chestnut brown that gleamed like polished leather where it wasn't matted with dust and dried blood. The horse was clearly injured, with a deep gash along its left flank and another wound on its front leg. Its breathing was labored, and its eyes, though alert, held the dull sheen of pain and exhaustion. Clara approached slowly, her heart pounding. She had always loved animals, but Mrs. Blackwood strictly forbade the children from keeping pets or even feeding strays. "Waste of food," she would say. "Animals serve a purpose or they don't deserve to live." But looking at this beautiful, wounded creature, Clara felt something stir deep within her chest. It was compassion, pure and simple, and it overrode every lesson Mrs. Blackwood had tried to beat into her about self-preservation and following rules. The horse lifted its head as she approached, and Clara could see intelligence in its dark eyes. There was no fear there, only a kind of weary resignation that she recognized all too well. This horse, like her, had learned that the world could be cruel, and that survival often meant enduring pain in silence. "Easy boy," Clara whispered, though she wasn't sure if the horse was male or female. "I'm not going to hurt you." She moved slowly, carefully, until she was close enough to see the full extent of the animal's injuries. The wounds looked fresh, probably from a mountain lion or perhaps barbed wire. Either way, the horse needed help, and it needed water desperately. Clara looked around nervously. She was supposed to fill the bucket and return immediately. Mrs. Blackwood would be timing her, and any delay would result in punishment. But the horse's labored breathing, and the way its tongue hung slightly from its mouth, told her that the animal was dangerously dehydrated. Making a decision that would change her life forever, Clara lowered the bucket into the well and drew up the cool, clear water. Instead of heading straight back to the orphanage, she carried the bucket to where the horse lay and carefully tilted it so the animal could drink. The horse's response was immediate and heartbreaking. It lifted its head with great effort and began to drink deeply, gratefully, as if Clara had just offered it life itself. Water dripped from its muzzle as it drank, and Clara could see some of the tension leave its body as the life-giving liquid soothed its parched throat. "There you go," Clara murmured softly, stroking the horse's neck with her free hand. The animal's coat was warm and surprisingly soft beneath the dust and grime. "Drink all you need." When the horse had finished drinking, it looked up at Clara with those intelligent dark eyes, and she could have sworn she saw gratitude there. The animal nuzzled her hand gently, its whiskers tickling her palm, and Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It had been so long since any living creature had shown her kindness or affection. But reality came crashing back as she heard Mrs. Blackwood's voice calling her name in the distance. Clara's blood turned to ice. She had been gone too long, and the bucket was now only half full. She quickly lowered it into the well again, her hands shaking as she drew up more water. "I have to go," she whispered to the horse, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'll try to come back. I promise." The horse watched her as she hurried away, bucket sloshing dangerously as she half ran, half stumbled back toward the orphanage. Clara's mind raced as she tried to think of an excuse for her delay, but she knew that Mrs. Blackwood would see through any lie she might tell. As she approached the orphanage, she could see Mrs. Blackwood standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, and her face set in the familiar expression of cold fury that Clara had learned to fear above all else. "Where have you been?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice was deceptively quiet, which Clara knew from experience was far more dangerous than when she shouted. The woman's pale blue eyes seemed to bore right through her, searching for any sign of deception. "The well, ma'am. I went to the well like you told me," Clara stammered, trying to keep her voice steady as she set the heavy bucket down near the orphanage's front steps. Mrs. Blackwood stepped closer, and Clara could smell the sharp scent of lye soap and something else, something bitter that always seemed to cling to the woman like a shroud. "It doesn't take half an hour to draw water from a well, Clara. What were you really doing out there?" Clara's mind raced. She couldn't tell the truth about the horse. Mrs. Blackwood would be furious that she had wasted water on an animal. But she had never been good at lying, and she could feel her cheeks burning with guilt and fear. I was just being careful, ma'am. The bucket is heavy, and I didn't want to spill any water," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, and Clara knew she wasn't buying the excuse. The woman reached out suddenly and grabbed Clara's chin, forcing her to look up into those cold, merciless eyes. "Don't lie to me, child. I can smell deception on you like cheap perfume. You were up to something out there, and I will find out what it was." Mrs. Blackwood's grip tightened, her fingernails digging into Clara's soft skin. "But first, you need to learn what happens to children who disobey me." Clara's heart sank as Mrs. Blackwood released her chin and turned toward the orphanage. She knew what was coming, the leather strap that hung behind Mrs. Blackwood's desk, the one that had left scars on more than one child's back over the years. "Inside." "Now," Mrs. Blackwood commanded, and Clara had no choice but to follow. The orphanage's interior was as bleak as its exterior. The walls were bare wood, stained dark with age and neglect, and the few windows were so grimy that they barely let in any light. The main room served as both dining area and classroom, with long wooden tables and benches that had been carved with the initials of countless children who had passed through these walls over the years. Mrs. Blackwood's office was at the back of the building, a small room that felt more like a prison cell than a place of administration. The woman gestured for Clara to enter, then closed the door behind them with a soft click that sounded as final as a coffin lid closing. "Remove your dress," Mrs. Blackwood said matter-of-factly, as if she were asking Clara to pass the salt at dinner. Clara's hands shook as she unbuttoned the simple brown dress that was her only decent piece of clothing. It had been donated by one of the town's more charitable families, and though it was patched and faded, it was still better than the rags that some of the other children wore. Mrs. Blackwood reached for the leather strap, a wicked-looking thing that was nearly 3 feet long and worn smooth from years of use. Clara had felt its bite before, and she knew that the pain would be excruciating. But worse than the physical pain was the humiliation, the way Mrs. Blackwood seemed to take pleasure in breaking down the children's spirits. "Turn around and place your hands on the desk," Mrs. Blackwood instructed, her voice taking on an almost sing-song quality that made Clara's skin crawl. Clara did as she was told, pressing her palms flat against the scarred wooden surface of the desk. She could feel tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had learned long ago that crying only made Mrs. Blackwood more vicious. The first blow came without warning, the leather strap cutting across Clara's back like a line of fire. She bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth broke the skin. The second blow followed quickly, then the third, each one precisely placed to cause maximum pain without doing permanent damage. Mrs. Blackwood was an expert at this kind of punishment. She knew exactly how much pain a child could endure without being seriously injured, and she took her time, savoring each strike like a fine wine. "This is what happens to children who lie to me," Mrs. Blackwood said between blows, her breathing slightly labored from the exertion. "This is what happens to those who think they can deceive me." By the time Mrs. Blackwood finished, Clara's back was a network of angry red welts, and she was struggling to remain standing. Her legs felt like water, and black spots danced at the edges of her vision. But she had not cried out, had not given Mrs. Blackwood the satisfaction of hearing her scream. "Get dressed and get out of my sight," Mrs. Blackwood said, hanging the strap back on its hook behind her desk. "And Clara, if I find out you were lying to me about what you were doing at that well, this will seem like a gentle caress compared to what I'll do to you next time." Clara pulled her dress back on with trembling hands, the rough fabric scraping against her wounded back like sandpaper. She stumbled out of the office and through the main room, past the other children who watched her with a mixture of sympathy and relief that it hadn't been them this time. She made it to the small dormitory where the girls slept before her legs finally gave out. Clara collapsed onto her thin mattress, burying her face in the lumpy pillow to muffle the sobs that she could no longer hold back. The pain in her back was nothing compared to the ache in her heart, the crushing weight of hopelessness that threatened to drown her. But even through her tears, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the horse. Those intelligent dark eyes, the way it had looked at her with such gratitude when she had given it water. In that moment, she had felt something she had almost forgotten existed, the simple joy of helping another living creature, of making a difference in someone else's suffering. As the sun began to set outside the dormitory's single window, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clara made a silent promise to herself. Tomorrow, somehow, she would find a way to check on the horse again. Mrs. Blackwood could beat her, could lock her in the cellar with the rats, could do whatever she wanted. But she couldn't stop Clara from caring, couldn't kill the compassion that burned bright in her young heart. The other girls in the dormitory gave her a wide berth that evening, knowing from experience that it was best to leave someone alone after they had been on the receiving end of Mrs. Blackwood's strap. But Clara didn't mind the solitude. It gave her time to think, to plan, to figure out how she might be able to help the wounded horse without getting caught. She thought about the animal's injuries, wondering if there was anything she could do to help them heal. She had seen the town doctor treat wounds before, had watched him clean cuts and apply bandages. Maybe she could find some clean cloth, maybe even some of the healing salve that Mrs. Blackwood kept locked in her medicine cabinet. As the night deepened and the other children fell asleep around her, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, her back throbbing with every heartbeat. But for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt something other than despair. She felt purpose, felt the stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference in this harsh, unforgiving world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for Mrs. Blackwood to make her life miserable. But it would also bring the chance to see the horse again, to offer whatever help she could to a fellow creature in need. And that thought, that small spark of hope, was enough to carry her through the long, painful night ahead. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Redemption Creek, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but never seemed to deliver. Clara woke before the other children, her back still aching from yesterday's beating, but her resolve stronger than ever. She had spent most of the night planning how she might help the wounded horse without arousing Mrs. Blackwood's suspicion. The morning routine at the orphanage was always the same, a breakfast of thin gruel and stale bread, followed by chores assigned by Mrs. Blackwood with military precision. Clara hoped she might be sent to the well again, but luck was not on her side. "Clara," Mrs. Blackwood announced after breakfast, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade, "you'll be scrubbing the floors today, all of them, and I want them clean enough to eat off of, do you understand?" Clara's heart sank, but she nodded obediently. "Yes, ma'am." The orphanage had 3 main rooms plus Mrs. Blackwood's office, and scrubbing all the floors would take most of the day. But as Clara filled her bucket with soapy water and got down on her hands and knees to begin the backbreaking work, her mind was already working on a plan. Around midday, when the sun was at its highest, and Mrs. Blackwood had retreated to her office for her afternoon rest, Clara saw her opportunity. She had finished 2 of the rooms and was working on the third when she heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Blackwood snoring drifting from behind the closed office door. Moving as quietly as a shadow, Clara crept to the kitchen area where Mrs. Blackwood kept her medical supplies. The woman was paranoid about the children getting into her things, so she kept everything locked in a wooden cabinet. But Clara had watched her open it many times, and she knew where the key was hidden behind a loose board near the window. Her hands shook as she retrieved the key and carefully unlocked the cabinet. Inside, she found what she was looking for: a small jar of healing salve that smelled of herbs and something else she couldn't identify, and several strips of clean white cloth that could serve as bandages. Clara quickly pocketed the items, locked the cabinet, and returned the key to its hiding place. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure Mrs. Blackwood would hear it, but the snoring continued uninterrupted from the office. Now came the hard part. Clara needed to get to the well without being seen, and she needed an excuse for leaving the orphanage. She thought quickly, then grabbed an empty water pitcher from the kitchen. If anyone saw her, she could claim she was getting fresh water for drinking. The walk to the well felt like the longest of Clara's life. Every shadow seemed to hide Mrs. Blackwood's watchful eyes. Every sound made her jump. But she made it to the well without incident, and her heart leaped when she saw that the horse was still there, lying in the same spot under the cottonwood tree. The animal looked worse than it had the day before. Its breathing was more labored, and the wounds on its flank and leg had attracted flies. But when it saw Clara approaching, it lifted its head and whinnied softly, as if greeting an old friend. "I came back just like I promised," Clara whispered, kneeling beside the horse and gently stroking its neck. "I brought some things that might help." She filled the pitcher with water and offered it to the horse, which drank gratefully. Then, working as carefully as she could, Clara began to clean the wounds with water and strips of cloth. The horse flinched at first but seemed to understand that she was trying to help, and it remained still as she worked. The gash on the horse's flank was deep and ugly, clearly infected. Clara applied the healing salve as gently as she could, then wrapped the wound with clean bandages. The cut on the front leg was not as severe, but she treated it the same way, talking softly to the horse the entire time. "There," she said when she had finished, sitting back on her heels to admire her work. "That should help. I wish I could do more, but—" The horse turned its head to look at her, and Clara could have sworn she saw understanding in its dark eyes. It nuzzled her hand gently, and she felt that same warm feeling in her chest that she had experienced the day before. "I have to go," Clara said reluctantly, glancing at the sun's position in the sky. "But I'll try to come back tomorrow, I promise." As she stood to leave, the horse did something unexpected. It struggled to its feet, swaying slightly but managing to stand. Clara gasped, afraid that she had somehow hurt it, but the horse seemed stronger than it had the day before. It took a tentative step toward her, then another, and Clara realized that her care had actually helped. "You're getting better," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You're actually getting better." The horse nuzzled her one more time, then settled back down in the shade. Clara filled the pitcher with fresh water and hurried back toward the orphanage, her heart lighter than it had been in years. But her joy was short-lived. As she approached the orphanage, she saw Mrs. Blackwood standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her face set in an expression of cold fury that made Clara's blood turn to ice. "And where exactly have you been, Clara?" Mrs. Blackwood asked, her voice deceptively calm. Clara's mind raced. She held up the pitcher of water, hoping her excuse would be believable. I finished the floors, ma'am, and I thought you might want fresh water for your afternoon tea." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as she studied Clara's face, searching for any sign of deception. "How thoughtful of you," she said finally, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I don't recall asking for fresh water, and I certainly don't recall giving you permission to leave the orphanage." Clara's heart sank. She could see in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes that the woman didn't believe her excuse, and she knew that another beating was coming. But this time, she found that she didn't care as much. The memory of the horse's grateful nuzzle, the knowledge that she had helped ease another creature's suffering, gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Clara said, meeting Mrs. Blackwood's gaze directly for the first time in years. "I was just trying to be helpful." Something in Clara's tone must have surprised Mrs. Blackwood, because the woman's expression shifted slightly. There was still anger there, but also a kind of puzzled curiosity, as if she couldn't quite figure out what had changed about the girl standing before her. "Go to your room," Mrs. Blackwood said finally. "We'll discuss your helpfulness after dinner." Clara nodded and walked past Mrs. Blackwood into the orphanage, her head held high despite the fear that gnawed at her stomach. She knew that whatever punishment awaited her would be severe, but she also knew that it would be worth it. For the first time in her life, she had done something that truly mattered, something that had made a real difference. As she sat on her thin mattress in the dormitory, waiting for the inevitable summons to Mrs. Blackwood's office, Clara thought about the horse. She wondered if it was still standing, if the bandages were staying in place, if the healing salve was working. She thought about its intelligent dark eyes and the way it had looked at her with such trust and gratitude. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to check on it again. Mrs. Blackwood could beat her, could lock her away, could do whatever she wanted. But she couldn't stop Clara from caring, couldn't kill the compassion that had taken root in her heart and was growing stronger with each passing moment. The other children in the dormitory watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. They had all seen the change in Clara, the way she carried herself differently now, and they sensed that something significant had happened. But Clara kept her secret to herself, holding it close like a precious treasure that no one could take away from her. As the sun set outside the window and the shadows grew long across the dormitory floor, Clara closed her eyes and pictured the horse standing strong and proud under the cottonwood tree. Whatever happened next, she had that image to hold on to, that proof that even in the darkest of places, kindness could still flourish and hope could still survive. The summons came just after dinner, as Clara had known it would. Mrs. Blackwood's voice echoed through the orphanage like the toll of a funeral bell, calling Clara to her office with the same cold authority that had terrorized children for years. But this time, something was different. As Clara walked toward the office, she noticed that Mrs. Blackwood seemed agitated in a way she had never seen before. The woman's usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing something underneath that looked almost like fear. "Sit down," Mrs. Blackwood commanded as Clara entered the office, but her voice lacked its usual venom. She paced behind her desk like a caged animal, her pale eyes darting nervously toward the window. Clara sat in the hard wooden chair across from the desk, her hands folded in her lap. She had expected to be ordered to remove her dress again, to feel the bite of the leather strap across her back. Instead, Mrs. Blackwood continued pacing, muttering under her breath in a way that made Clara's skin crawl. "There are things happening in this town," Mrs. Blackwood said suddenly, stopping her pacing to stare directly at Clara. "Strange things, dangerous things, and I have reason to believe that you might know something about them." Clara's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't understand, ma'am." Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the desk. "Don't play innocent with me, child. I know you've been sneaking around, going places you shouldn't go, and now there are reports of things that don't make sense." "What kind of reports?" Clara asked, genuinely confused. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "The kind that involve wild horses appearing where they shouldn't be, acting in ways that horses don't act. The kind that make people nervous, make them ask questions about what's really going on in this godforsaken town." Clara's blood turned to ice. Someone had seen the horse. Someone had reported it to Mrs. Blackwood. But who? And what exactly had they seen? "I still don't understand what this has to do with me," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Blackwood straightened up, her expression shifting from confusion to cold calculation. "Because, my dear Clara, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think you've been involved with this creature from the beginning, and I think it's time you told me the truth." Before Clara could respond, a sound from outside made both of them freeze. It was the thunder of hoofbeats, growing louder by the second, accompanied by shouts and screams from the direction of the town center. Mrs. Blackwood rushed to the window, her face pale with terror. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It can't be, not now." Clara stood up and moved toward the window, trying to see what had frightened Mrs. Blackwood so badly. What she saw made her gasp in amazement and terror. Racing down the main street of Redemption Creek was the horse she had been caring for, but it looked nothing like the wounded, dying animal she had left by the well. This horse was magnificent, powerful, its chestnut coat gleaming in the fading sunlight like polished copper. Its wounds had healed completely, leaving no trace of the injuries that had nearly killed it just days before. But that wasn't the most shocking thing. The most shocking thing was that the horse was heading straight for the orphanage, and its eyes, those intelligent dark eyes that Clara knew so well, were fixed on the building with unmistakable purpose. "How is this possible?" Mrs. Blackwood whispered, backing away from the window. "The reports said it was just a wild horse, nothing more. But this is something else entirely." Clara watched in amazement as the horse skidded to a stop in front of the orphanage. It reared up on its hind legs, pawing at the air and whinnying with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Then it settled back down and began to pace back and forth in front of the door, as if waiting for something. "It's looking for me," Clara said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "It knows I'm here." Mrs. Blackwood spun around to face her, and Clara saw something in the woman's eyes that she had never seen before, genuine fear. "What have you done?" Mrs. Blackwood hissed. "What kind of devil's bargain have you made?" "I just gave it water," Clara said, her voice filled with wonder. "I cleaned its wounds and gave it water. That's all. That's all." Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose to a near shriek. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know what that thing is?" Clara shook her head, confused by Mrs. Blackwood's reaction. "It's just a horse. A hurt horse that I helped." Mrs. Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the laugh of someone who had seen their worst nightmare come to life. "Just a horse. Oh, you foolish, foolish child. That's no ordinary horse. That's a Mustang, a wild stallion from the deep desert. And according to the old stories, the Apache stories that the traders whisper about in the saloons, when a Mustang like that bonds with someone, when it chooses someone, it will protect them with its life. Clara's eyes widened as the implications of Mrs. Blackwood's words sank in. Protect them from what? Mrs. Blackwood's face twisted into an expression of pure malice. From whatever threatens them, from whoever has hurt them, from anyone who has caused them pain. As if summoned by her words, the horse outside let out another thunderous whinny, and Clara heard the sound of splintering wood as it began to kick at the orphanage's front door. "It knows," Mrs. Blackwood whispered, her face going white as a sheet. "Somehow it knows what I've done to you, what I've done to all of you." The kicking continued, growing more violent with each blow. Clara could hear the other children screaming and crying in the main room, terrified by the sound of the massive animal trying to break down their door. "You have to stop it," Mrs. Blackwood said, grabbing Clara by the shoulders and shaking her. "You have to make it go away, if it gets in here, if it sees what I've done." "What you've done," Clara repeated, pulling away from Mrs. Blackwood's grip. "You mean the beatings, the starvation, the way you've terrorized every child who's ever lived in this place." Mrs. Blackwood's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cruel, twisted person she had always been underneath. "They deserved it," she snarled. "All of them. Worthless orphans with no family, no future, no purpose except to learn their place in the world. I was doing them a favor, teaching them that life is hard and that only the strong survive." The front door finally gave way with a tremendous crash, and Clara heard the horse's hoofbeats echoing through the main room of the orphanage. The other children's screams grew louder, but Clara realized that they weren't screams of terror anymore. They were screams of joy, of liberation, of hope finally arriving after years of despair. "It's too late," Clara said, looking Mrs. Blackwood directly in the eye. "You can't hide what you are anymore, and you can't hurt us anymore." Mrs. Blackwood backed toward the far corner of her office, her eyes wild with panic. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If that thing finds me, if it sees what I've done, the stories say that Mustangs like that don't just protect, they punish. They make sure that those who hurt their chosen ones pay for what they've done." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer now, accompanied by the excited voices of children who had never dared to hope that rescue might come. Clara could hear them calling her name, telling her that the beautiful horse was looking for her, that it had come to take her away from this terrible place. "Maybe," Clara said quietly, "it's time you learned what it feels like to be afraid. Maybe it's time you understood what it's like to be helpless and alone, with no one to protect you from something bigger and stronger than you are." Mrs. Blackwood opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the office door exploded inward, and the magnificent chestnut stallion filled the doorway like an avenging angel, its dark eyes fixed on Mrs. Blackwood with an intensity that made the woman shrink back against the wall, whimpering like a frightened child. The horse stepped into the room, its hoofbeats echoing like thunder on the wooden floor. It looked at Clara with those intelligent eyes, and she saw recognition there, gratitude, and something else. Something that looked almost like justice. The stallion stood in the doorway of Mrs. Blackwood's office like a force of nature made flesh, its powerful frame filling the space with a presence that seemed to make the very air crackle with energy. Clara felt no fear as she looked into those familiar dark eyes, only a sense of profound connection and gratitude that took her breath away. Mrs. Blackwood, however, was a different story entirely. The woman who had terrorized countless children over the years was now pressed against the far wall of her office, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her face had gone completely white, and her eyes were wide with a terror that Clara had never seen before. "Please," Mrs. Blackwood whispered, her voice barely audible. I was just trying to teach them discipline. They needed to learn." The stallion took a step forward, its hooves striking the wooden floor with the sound of judgment itself. It lowered its head slightly, fixing Mrs. Blackwood with a stare that seemed to see right through to her black heart. Clara moved slowly toward the magnificent animal, her hand extended. "Easy, boy," she said softly. "It's all right. I'm safe now. The horse turned its attention to Clara, and its entire demeanor changed. The fierce intensity remained, but it was tempered now with gentleness, with the same gratitude she had seen when she first gave it water by the well. It nuzzled her hand softly, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "You came back for me," she whispered, stroking the stallion's powerful neck. "You actually came back." Behind them, Mrs. Blackwood made a sudden movement toward her desk, perhaps reaching for a weapon or trying to escape. But the stallion's head snapped around immediately, and it let out a warning whinny that froze the woman in place. "Don't," Clara said, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Mrs. Blackwood or the horse. "She's not worth it. She's already lost everything that matters." And it was true. Clara could hear voices outside, adult voices, concerned voices. The commotion had drawn attention from the town, and people were coming to investigate. Mrs. Blackwood's reign of terror was over, whether the horse punished her or not. "Clara," a voice called from the main room. "Clara, are you all right?" It was Dr. Morrison, the town's physician, and Clara had never been so happy to hear another human voice in her life. Behind him, she could hear other townspeople, their voices filled with shock and outrage as they saw the conditions in which the orphans had been living. "I'm here," Clara called back. "I'm in the office." Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the scene before him. The magnificent stallion, Clara standing beside it with her hand on its neck, and Mrs. Blackwood cowering in the corner like a trapped animal. "Good Lord," Dr. Morrison breathed. "What happened here?" "Justice," Clara said simply. "Justice finally happened." Over the next few hours, the truth about Mrs. Blackwood's treatment of the orphans came pouring out. The other children, no longer afraid to speak, told story after story of abuse, neglect and cruelty that shocked even the hardened residents of Redemption Creek. Mrs. Blackwood was arrested and taken away, her protests and excuses falling on deaf ears. The stallion remained by Clara's side through it all, as if understanding that she needed its protection and support. When the authorities tried to approach it, thinking it might be dangerous, Clara spoke up. "He won't hurt anyone," she said firmly. "He's my friend. He saved me." Dr. Morrison, who had examined Clara's back and seen the evidence of Mrs. Blackwood's brutality, nodded slowly. "I've heard stories about wild horses forming bonds with people who show them kindness," he said, "but I never thought I'd see it with my own eyes." As the sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Clara found herself standing outside the orphanage with the stallion beside her. The other children had been taken in by various families in the town, at least temporarily, but Clara had nowhere to go. "What happens now?" she asked Dr. Morrison, who had stayed to make sure she was all right. The doctor smiled kindly. "Well, my wife and I have been talking about that. We've always wanted children, but we were never blessed with any of our own. If you'd like, you could come and live with us. We have a small ranch outside of town with plenty of room for," he glanced at the stallion, "for both of you." Clara's heart leaped with joy, but she looked at the horse uncertainly. "What about him? He's wild. He belongs in the desert, running free." As if understanding her words, the stallion nuzzled her gently, then took a step back. For a moment, Clara thought he was going to leave, to return to the wild places where he belonged. But instead, he moved to stand beside her again, his dark eyes fixed on her face with unmistakable devotion. "I think," Dr. Morrison said with a chuckle, "that horse has made his choice. He's not going anywhere without you." Clara threw her arms around the stallion's neck, burying her face in his warm, soft coat. "Then we'll stay together," she whispered. "Always." 3 months later, Clara stood in the pasture behind Dr. Morrison's ranch, watching the stallion, whom she had named Thunder, graze peacefully in the morning sun. The wounds on her back had healed, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of her past rather than chains that bound her to it. She had learned to ride Thunder, and together they would explore the vast desert landscape that surrounded Redemption Creek. The horse had never tried to leave, never shown any desire to return to his wild herd. He seemed content to stay with Clara, to be her protector and companion. Dr. Morrison and his wife, Sarah, had welcomed Clara into their home with open arms, giving her the love and stability she had never known. They treated her like the daughter they had always wanted, and Clara flourished under their care. Sometimes, when she was riding Thunder across the desert, Clara would think about Mrs. Blackwood, who was serving time in the territorial prison for her crimes. She felt no hatred for the woman, only pity for someone who had been so consumed by cruelty that she had forgotten how to be human. But mostly, Clara thought about the future. Dr. Morrison was teaching her to read and write, and Sarah was showing her how to cook and keep house. They talked about sending her to school in the territorial capital when she was older, about giving her all the opportunities that had been denied to her for so long. And through it all, Thunder was there beside her, a constant reminder that kindness and compassion could triumph over cruelty and despair. He had taught her that even the smallest act of mercy could change everything, that love and loyalty were forces more powerful than any amount of hatred or fear. As Clara watched Thunder lift his head to look at her, his dark eyes filled with the same intelligence and devotion she had seen that first day by the well, she smiled. She had given him water when he was dying, and in return, he had given her something far more precious: hope, freedom, and the knowledge that she was worthy of love. Together, they had found their way home.